Good evening, HR Afterworkers, and welcome to this 13th webinar proposed by Munich HR AfterWork. I am Marie, one of the three organizers, together with our dear Sushma and with our new joiner, Maria Krause, which you will be introduced to from our video teaser that was published in early September. So in case you have missed it, simply have a look at our most recent publications to learn more about her. We are glad to kickstart this interesting session hosted by our insightful speaker, Marie Truchassou, Global Mobility Freelancer with a 4 years expat experience in India, whose purpose is to empower organizations, employees, and managers to embrace their international exposure by providing strategic support in international HR, while bringing added value tips from her personal international experience. Marie selected two key topics for tonight, being the impact of COVID-19 on global mobility and the specific case scenario of managing global mobility in a country with no legal entity. So before I hand over the floor to Marie, be aware that we launched our Slack community very recently. You will access all materials you need to connect and get started from our LinkedIn profile. And if interested, we can also use your email address and send you a direct invitation. Just let us know. And as Marie kindly proposed, she will host a channel in Slack dedicated to global mobility. So if you want to stay in touch with her and access regular publications, discussions on the matter, simply join us there. So enjoy your time with us tonight, and Marie, the floor is back to you.
Thank you, Marie. Thank you for granting me the opportunity to discuss about global mobility. I think it's the first time ever we do for the HR Munich AfterWork, so thank you for that. Let me share my screen. So first, before digging into the topic, because some of you are not necessarily global mobility experts, let's get back to the basics. What is global mobility? So global mobility is about managing transfers of employees from one country to another for a temporary period of time or permanently. So global mobility is a niche technical HR field. And for our first session, I did not want to dig into technical topics, but rather to grant you the opportunity to touch some topics that may have an interest for you in your daily HR experience and even in your personal life. So indeed, jointly with Marie, we have decided to include in today's session a big portion about COVID-19 and another section and another focus about how to manage global mobility and employees transfer in the situation where you don't have any entity in the host country. So let's start about COVID-19, but you can't expect things to stay the same, to remain the same. Basically, who could have guessed by January 2020 that our life would have changed so drastically? Global mobility has always been about expect the unexpected, but the COVID-19 crisis has really challenged us to lose control and to continuously adjust to an unstable situation. So this is definitely true not only about global mobility, but for you as an HR expert and as well in your daily life. Try to assess and to think about how you believe COVID-19 has impacted global mobility, and you will see on your screen some suggestions shared by other colleagues in HR. So now let's move to all the list of topics and fields that have been impacted by COVID-19 in global mobility. And the first topic I want to highlight is about the Great Resignation. So some of you may have heard of it. COVID-19 has triggered what we call a great resignation wave, especially in some countries like in the US currently, but we can expect to face the same in Europe very shortly. What about great resignation? What does it mean? We see a bit of exodus of people and the market is active again, and a lot of people are leaving their current jobs at this point. Two different situations: either they leave their job to integrate another company, or they leave that job because they have decided to follow another path, another career, another, let's say, passion, and they have decided to take the leap of faith about that. So overall, what is behind? There are multiple reasons for that. Trend: many companies who haven't dealt with retention and have not worked on an inclusive corporate culture or have not built a talent and retention program efficient enough, basically they are facing this situation today. Besides, other important point and other important reason, for some people, remote working has really become part of their mandatory well-being requirements, and they are no longer willing to compromise about that. And I think they have tasted about working remotely, and they don't want to let this way of working go away. So with regards to global mobility specifically, you need to realize that COVID-19 crisis has even been tougher for expats. Indeed, COVID-19 has led them to reassess the level of difficulty of living abroad, being far away from their home country and their family. And for some of them, it has led to change their mind and even ask for repatriation because they were not able to continue and to pursue their expat in the host country. So now it is time for organizations to reassess their global mobility programs and as well to develop incentive and retention measures to mitigate this situation if possible. On top of this, for some organizations, it has led to very difficult and complex discussions while offering an international assignment offer. Earlier, the expats program were tending to become more and more lighter in terms of benefits. The organization backing up this trend with a speech: you are offered an international assignment, this is an investment from us, it will be a great added value for you, so please go ahead. Now it has become more and more difficult to back up this trend only with words and to convince people to go for this anyway. As such, for me, it's a key moment for any organization to revamp their international HR strategy, to consider and to assimilate this new reality that we face with COVID-19. So now let's move to another important topic, which is work from home. And I think from the results of the survey that HR AfterWork Munich has sent during the summer, a lot of people were highlighting this key topic. Basically, work from home and remote work are all new reality as of today, and it is likely to go beyond the crisis. So most companies had to move to a remote work mode, and for some employees, they took the chance to travel to their home country to perform work remotely. Not only people who are coming back to the home country, but as well some employees took the chance in this time of crisis to be a digital nomad and escape somehow from the countries having the tighter restrictions. Compliance was always managed by the employer in such a situation, but they were managing it with the assumption that they knew the location where their employees were working. With remote work, this assumption is really only an assumption. Besides, what we need to be careful about is that such assumption requires a company to carefully track not only the location, but as well the number of days spent in every irrespective country. And this may trigger some very tricky conversation about privacy and communication and trust with the employees about answering the question, where are you now and how many days are you spending there? What about if the employees are not transparent about their work location and it creates a compliance risk for the companies? Very tricky question. So let's take a concrete example. Let's take the Irish one. At the beginning of the crisis in 2020, some very famous companies like Google, Yahoo, or Facebook had a strong headcount of foreigners based and located in Ireland, and with a strong emphasis on employees as most valuable assets. So basically what happened when the COVID-19 crisis kicked in, the employees asked to be authorized to come back to their home country and to work remotely from there. Of course, these employees just said yes, and the employees came back to their home country. But who could have imagined that the COVID-19 crisis would last so long? No one. And I think each of us was quite optimistic about its resolution and expecting it to go back to normal quite shortly. However, these companies at some point realized that this solution was creating key and tricky compliance topics. Indeed, while the temporary just became almost permanent, each individual situation started to create a lot of compliance issues where every situation was needing to be assessed on an individual basis. Having employees working abroad and performing work from abroad and from another country than the country of employment is raising a lot of compliance issues. You get a short list here. The first one and the key one, of course, is the tax impact. It's for the individual, but not only about individual tax. It is as well in terms of corporate tax for the employer. In terms of individual tax, basically, situation is quite easy. An assessment of the location of the tax liability is necessary. And as an employer, you have the duty, especially in case of mandatory tax withholding, to ensure that your employee's tax situation is properly managed. In some situations, you may have had double taxation, then you get the question, who is supposed to support the extra cost from the situation? Very key question here. And for corporate tax, the impact was quite significant too, in the sense that the employer was due to ensure its compliance and remittance of corporate tax, if any, in the country where the employee may have been located on a temporary basis. So this situation overall, individual tax, corporate tax, has just triggered unexpected cost for the employer. Either in terms of tax to be paid, that was not expected and not budgeted, of course, but not only, it's as well in terms of time spent by the HR teams to ensure compliance about this, and as well fees from reliable tax providers in order to assist and to help for the assessment and the management of such tricky situation. So definitely supporting employees in allowing them to work remotely from another country, it is not a decision without any financial impact. And most companies were unprepared for that. So just be very careful in your personal experience as an HR. Okay, maybe today, and especially within Europe, it's quite easy to move an employee from one country to another, but you cannot do this without tax assessments about the potential impact of such a decision. The second key point impacted by this was social security. Indeed, social security, the key principle, we can say, is that normally you are supposed to pay your social security contribution in the country where the employee is physically performing work. So companies here had to investigate how they could maintain, ideally in a perfect world, and if it was possible, contribution in the home country of employment, while on the other side, investigating if contributions were due in the host country where the employee is physically performing work. And in some situation, it has triggered some situation where contributions were due in the host country, and as such, it was an extra cost for the company. So same situation than for tax. Don't just decide to say yes to employees to go and work remotely from another country. Take the time to make the assessment. Take the time to identify the financial impact before making any decision. But not only about that, you get other compliance topics that needs to be taken care of, and the list is quite long, so I'm just focusing on the key points. You get immigration. Sometimes you may have an impact into immigration, especially in terms of the employee being able to retain his or her visa, his residence permit as well. Medical healthcare coverage. Is the medical healthcare coverage applicable in this new country, let's say, of physically attendance and for a temporary period of time? Is it working? Many other topics that needs to be checked out on an individual basis and needs to be anticipated, basically. So as you can imagine, this implies a lot of work for global mobility managers, and it's important to focus on that and to take care of that, not only to decide to say yes to employees for working remotely. So let's move to another key topic that we have just quickly touched so far. It's about the impact into medical healthcare and especially medical insurance, repatriation insurance. So what we need to be aware is that very often the medical insurance plan and repatriation insurance plan, and let's say it's the basic of almost any insurance plan, is that it includes a pandemic clause. So basically, very often insurance plan includes specific provisions about pandemics, which consider that their coverage will not be fully applicable or just partially applicable in terms of in period of time of pandemic. And so what happened here is that what was considered as unlikely became suddenly our reality and our day-to-day. So meaning that in some situation, if the insurance coverage was excluding pandemic situation, a possible risk became reality. So this required for companies to renegotiate the scope of their insurance, or if not possible, to cover the cost directly on their own, because the insurance could not be able to take care of this cost directly if the risk was happening. So overall, what we can see is that it has led to an increase either of insurance cost, either in terms of risk management cost, which it's not almost not a risk management cost now because it's a reality management cost. But even in case your insurance coverage was including pandemic situation, still employers have faced some tricky situation in terms of ensuring that the employees will be effectively covered. One recent and very heartbreaking example coming from India this spring during the second wave. Basically, the healthcare system totally collapsed, and at the same time, repatriation flights were strictly controlled and limited. And basically, like locals, foreigners struggled to get the appropriate level of care, and even for some famous repatriation insurance brokers, I will not say the name, but it's a very famous one, managing an effective repatriation from India was almost impossible to organize. So it led to very heartbreaking situation in terms of managing a medical situation for expats. Despite having a strong, let's say, insurance coverage, unfortunately, for some of them, they did not get the appropriate level of care as they should have been able to get in a perfect world. So now let's move about another topic, an important topic, which is repatriation, and especially the company's repatriation process. So normally, repatriation process is part of the risk management strategy of any organization, and they rarely, let's say, occur. And as such, for me, I can speak from experience. You may have a repatriation process in place, but it's not something that you waste so much time, let's say, to prepare and to be so much in the details, unfortunately. And some recent example we can share about repatriation process. We can speak about the Fukushima situation in Japan some decade ago, or some earthquake situation where sometimes it's decided to repatriate back the expats on a temporary basis. But overall, most of organizations were just facing repatriation process for one country, or very rare situation, a region. But here with this pandemic, basically, it was almost global. Global repatriation, I would say, was necessary for some regions or some countries. And it was a workload and a situation that no company had expected. Repatriation process were mostly focused on one country, but not necessarily on a global scale like it happened. And repatriation is a very tough decision for expatriates as it implies a significant impact into the company's organization and performance. And of course, it triggers a lot of cost. So some local regulations put a significant liability on the employer's shoulders in terms of safety and security of their employees and expatriates. And one concrete example, the French labor law set up a very strong requirement about that, in the sense that it's not only being able to guarantee safety by any means, it's that you just need to ensure that the employee is safe and right and whatever you do. And if it's not the case, you just need to support the cost and to be liable for anything happening. So the first key question here was that organization had to wonder how and when to repatriate. And in this situation, the question was, is repatriation riskier than asking the employees to stay home in terms of contamination, especially at the beginning of the crisis where we did not get so much information about how it could spread. So it was quite a tricky situation for the organization. And here what happened mostly, embassies and consulates provided some support to companies to make such decision, advising on the local risk assessment and helping even logistically to set up the repatriation for its citizens. However, some companies had to face challenge in case they did not have a suitable repatriation process in place. Or sometimes the process was available on the paper, but not working logistically speaking, as never tested or implemented in the past. Besides, on top of that, you may have had some roadblocks or logistical challenge, if we can say, impacting the capacity of the organization to plan repatriation of their employees, because in such case, of course, it was several organizations trying at the same time to repatriate their employees at a very global scale, so it was quite difficult to organize. And in some countries, it may have a big, let's say, roadblock in the sense the country may be under lockdown and even preventing repatriation to happen in the sense that restrictions for flight and organization of flight may have been applicable. So one concrete example you can get in mind was about India, who got their borders closed for a certain period of time. And today we can share the example, of course, of Australia, and with a very, very strong restriction about flights in and out from Australia. And the restriction is quite tough, even for their own citizens. So overall, this has led any organization, it not only making the decision, triggers the repatriation, but as well to get it done while ensuring the cost to be controlled. Keeping in mind this particular situation that practices and what you do from a logistical standpoint need to be carefully monitored, in the sense that in the expat world, everything you do as an employer is being shared, gossiped, and either put as an example or as a blame. So one key example I can share with you today is about the French embassy. They decided to organize some repatriation flights in India during the period where there was such restrictions for fly in and fly out, and with a strong lockdown period. And some organizations, they decided to ask for priority for their own employees, while on the other hand, other French citizens were struggling to get a seat on their flight. And the tricky situation was that normally for such flights, priority was given to kids, their parents, usually preferably the mother, and people having comorbidities and with high risk with COVID. So these people were supposed to be given priorities. But this organization, with their power, were able to get seats in their flight for people not matching the initial priority requirements. And basically, it got spread. It got spread, and even if this push was for sure highly appreciated by the employees of this organization, this company at the end had to suffer from gossip and very bad reputation as taking advantage from their position, while some, let's say, just regular citizens matching the requirements were not able to get their seats in the flight. So be careful about that, and I think such bad reputation, it's like a stain, and it takes a long time to remove, so be very careful about what you do. You consider you are doing the best for your employees, but it may have a significant cost on the other hand that you need to mitigate and to anticipate. So, speaking about logistics, we can move to another key point, of course, it's immigration and its impact. So, even more than before, you need to anticipate today because of COVID. Basically, some countries are restricting their access to that territory to certain visa categories. One example today, the US, of course, not allowing people having permanent residency to travel to the US, or we can speak about India, still restricting some visa categories as of today. So be careful about that. Check not only in terms of immigration, but as well in terms of which visa categories are authorized on the country. In some countries, despite having a valid employment visa, expatriate may not be authorized to enter the country. For new applicants, sometimes embassies decide for a temporary period of time not to process any new application, fresh application. So you need to double check that. Some countries as well may consider granting access only depending on the job criticality, let's say. For example, for healthcare workers, logistic or transport workers, or army project, defense projects, stuff like that. Of course, you may be aware that quarantine may be required at the arrival, and other formalities like a PCR test may be mandatory prior to the flight or even after, or both. And home quarantine or governmental organized quarantine may be applicable. So you need to be very careful and to double check that. Overall, the rules are very much unstable, and employers need to keep a very close track of what's going on and need to try to be quite proactive, as from one day to another and sometimes without any notice period, rules can change. What you need to be extremely careful is that the rules sometimes don't only depend on the country, but as well on the state. One example, at some point, different rules were applicable in the US. Today, it's just same rules everywhere in the US, but for example, what is applicable today in India, quarantine rules are totally different from one state to another. So you need to double check carefully what is applicable in the state. So always try to be proactive, check the rules in the state, but not only in the country, but not only in the state or the district or even the city in some situation, because some cities may have specific regulations. So formalities overall about COVID needs to become part of the immigration process, and vaccine at some point may become a mandatory requirement for visa application. So you may have to provide the vaccine certificate confirming that the employee is vaccinated so that you are eligible to apply for the visa. One important point that you need to anticipate, and I feel like I'm saying only about important points, but it's quite tricky, that's why. The vaccine that the employee may have been eligible to in the home country may not be necessarily recognized in the host country. So you need to be very careful about that. Check if the vaccine has been recognized. Try as well sometimes, because it's required and it will smooth the process, to get a translation of the vaccination certificate if it's not in English, to make life easier for the employee. So just be proactive and careful about the type and the brand of vaccine, because it may have a significant impact. And despite being fully vaccinated in their home country, they may still be considered as non-vaccinated upon arrival, and they may need to go through again all the vaccine process because the vaccine is not recognized. So definitely something to anticipate. So yes, let's move now to what is the most suitable vaccine brand, and I think it's just a consequence about what I was saying earlier. In a regular employer-employee situation, I think the employer is not necessarily supposed to advise the employee about the vaccine brand choice. And even we can say it's not necessarily advisable to do so, but let's be honest, in a global mobility situation where you need to comply with the rules of another country as duty of care, you need to ensure that your employees get access to reliable vaccine while ensuring that the vaccine will be recognized in both countries. So something, basically the decision of the vaccine brand that normally is just up to the employee's decision. Here it's slightly different. It's important that you highlight to them the potential impact of choosing one brand versus another. What we can say as well in terms of tough subject about vaccine is that expatriates assign about what we can call low-cost countries. Usually they face the situations where the brands are unfortunately what we can call low cost and not necessarily recognized in other countries. So organization needs as well to anticipate situation where there is no vaccine available yet in the country. And some of them, in such situations, they may even decide to repatriate on a temporary basis the employees so that they can get the vaccine in their home country. Other option, which happened, some organizations with the support of embassies and consulates have developed their own vaccine strategy to ensure that their local employees and the expats were getting a jab. However, this is not so easy as it seems. Indeed, for local people not part of the organization and then not eligible to the jab, this has created a very significant frustration, and it has even led in some situations to political disputes and riots targeting the organization or the embassy organizing this vaccination. Indeed, this may be understood as a very favorable treatment and somehow discrimination, and as such it may have a very significant impact into the employer's branding. So overall, one example about this that happened in India, French embassy organized vaccine for their citizens at a time where only the low cost, if we can say, vaccines were available on the market. So to ensure safety, let's say, of their citizens, the French embassy organized some jabs with, I think it was Moderna, if I remember well. And only French citizens and Indian spouse of French citizens or family, very close family members of French citizens could get the jabs. But the news got spread about that in the newspaper in India, and considering it was not authorized in India at the time to get Moderna from a legal standpoint, but the French embassy was able to get a derogation about that. It has created a big political dispute in the sense why Indian citizens were not eligible for Moderna, while French citizens were. Yes, it's a tricky situation. You want to avoid to be taken in such a political, I would say, shitstorm in such a case. So be careful. You believe that you are trying to do the best for your employees, but you can see it may be considered differently on a more political and global scale. So as you can see overall, COVID-19 has got a very broad impact into global mobility and international HR. Every day we are still discovering new impacts and adjusting to what we can say maybe a potential new normal. And I think it was just a broad picture I was trying to give you about what I can see from my own experience and while working with different clients. But we can definitely expect other additional topics to be, let's say, brought up from time to time, depending on how long the crisis will continue. So let's move to the next topic now, which is about umbrella company. Sorry, I got one moment. Let's move to the next time. And yes, the second part was how to manage global mobility in a country with no legal entity, and especially with one strong focus about one of the key solutions you may have in such situation, which is the umbrella companies. So let me move this here. So I feel more and more that HR strategies for development to another country, host country, does not necessarily imply to create an entity, let's say on a very short-term basis. First, what we can identify is that it's a very significant move to create an entity. It needs that you need to be very sure about the potential of business you can get there. You need to be sure that sometimes you can manufacture there and there is a capability to manufacture there. While on the other end, it's creating a lot of cost in terms of creating an entity, but as well a lot of formalities and time spent by the teams to make it happen. Lots of compliance as well, and with a potential processing times that can be anticipated to be months or even years in some tricky situation. So now what we can see that more and more companies are willing to investigate first about the potential new host country, and they need to investigate alternative options which can be offered to assign their people, their employees, to be able to check out this country and while not having an entity yet. So overall here, for me, there are some key different situations. First, as you can see, business trips. Business trips, I think in everyone's mind, it's always quite easy to manage. Even with no entity, as usually it's not necessarily requiring a visa. Or if they do, the client, the provider, you can still find someone quite easily that can issue an invite letter so that you can apply for a business visa. So the key point of not having an entity here in the host country, it's not necessarily so tricky here. You can still find some solution. But what you need to be careful about is that business trips are normally supposed to be only for prospection, negotiation, and not effective work. In no instance, it's supposed to cover some situation of effective work and to cover a long-term situation. I had to manage regularization of people just 2 months ago, of people under business visa for almost 1 year. 1 year, it's not a business visa any longer for a long time. You cannot say it's just for negotiation and prospection, and it's not effective work. So try to be careful to really anticipate that and to avoid the struggle of regularizing a situation where we all know that they should never have had a business visa. So as an HR, you absolutely need to ensure that manager, when using the word business trips, they have that in mind. It's a real business trip. It's not a disguised business trip, let's say. And if the activity is supposed to be work and can be renewed, extended for a significant period of time, it can be a business trip, but it may require to move to an employment visa instead of a business visa. So be very careful about that. For short period business trips, there is not so much compliance risk, but still you need to be careful because as the employer, you need to ensure to assess the immigration, like discussed just earlier, potential impact into tax at some point if the employee is having regular trips or staying for a certain period of time in the host country, it may trigger a tax impact on an individual and corporate tax basis. Social security as well, you need to be careful about, and safety and security, of course. So what is important here? About the situation manageable without legal entity, of course, the secondment within European Union as per European regulation, it's quite easy to manage, and I think for us living in EU, we don't necessarily realize it on a daily basis, but it's quite magical that we can move from one country to another without any visa, without any tracking, let's say formality or immigration tracking as such. So still, it's quite easy to manage. Secondment will mean that basically you keep the employee under home country contract and payroll while paying social security contribution in the home country, and you don't have to pay any social security contribution in the host country. So here, from a cost perspective, it's quite interesting and optimized, if we can say. One key point of concern here, tax. It needs to be mitigated, it needs to be anticipated, but it needs mostly to be defined on an individual basis, as the tax situation may differ depending on the personal situation. So in terms of secondment, always be careful. Okay, it's EU, okay, it's easy, okay, today I'm in France, tomorrow I'm in Germany, but yes, be careful about tax, because tax can be kind of a boomerang coming back to your face and being kind of quite costly at some point. Other situation where secondment and let's say long-term assignment can be quite easy to manage. It's the case where secondment in other countries. So here I'm speaking out from the EU situation, where basically the employment visa does not require any contract with the host entity. So then it's quite easy. You manage a secondment. It's a situation quite similar from the secondment within EU, but with a big difference. You may have some social security contributions to be paid in the host country, and you need to double check that. So on top of the tax impact, you may have social security contributions impact that you need to anticipate. So here are two key points to keep in mind. If you don't get any legal entity, it's quite easy to manage if you do the transfer within EU, or if you do the transfer with a country where there is no requirement of a local contract with the host entity. But what happens if you need a host entity? Let's imagine for the visa, employment visa, you need a contract with a local entity, a local payroll, but you don't have any entity. So here the hot fix is the umbrella company. So basically, it's very useful, especially in case you need to deploy your resource in host country, and the entity setup can be quite long, but you need the resource to be deployed tomorrow. And if you are in the situation where you wish to investigate the market first, and you want to grant yourself the time to assess if it's really worth it, and you want to grant yourself the time to decide if you need and you want to create a legal entity locally. So the umbrella company will host your employees, issue them a local contract, run the payroll, and issue any supporting document necessary for the visa application, allowing to get your employment visa for your employee. What is important to keep in mind is that it can be a temporary solution while you manage the entity's creation process, while you investigate your market opportunities, but it can be considered as well as a permanent solution. I know that some companies, they are not very comfortable to create an entity to this country, but they still want to investigate the potential of the market. And for them, having an umbrella company is a very good way for them to ensure that their employee can go there, effectively investigate the options, while not taking the leap of faith, let's say, of creating an entity and the struggle coming with such a situation, if we can say. So what is important, and I wanted to highlight because I know that umbrella companies, it's not necessarily an easy solution, or let's say not necessarily easy, but I would say common solution that we have in mind. But umbrella company is quite easy to trigger from the moment you have identified your provider, but you have still some challenges that you need to keep in mind. So of course, the first challenge for me is the integration with your policies and your processes, because basically it means that you need to manage another company managing the management of your employees on your behalf. So you see what I mean? Quite complicated. You need to set up policies, rules, objectives very clear to the umbrella company, and to design your process so that internally on your side, you can manage it properly as well from a finance and HR perspective. So here, if you decide to implement this, you need to ask yourself how to integrate the use of umbrella company in global mobility's processes and policies and processes. And if you want it to be efficient, definitely you need to ask yourself and to work on this as a first step. Then, of course, how to choose your umbrella company. Here you have got different solutions and different approaches. You get some global players. They offer you umbrella services for any country you wish to go through. Or you can use some local players. What I can highlight now as a trend I can see is that more and more you can get a digital, I would say, umbrella company, in the sense where you connect to the website, you upload the document about the employee, you make the payment, upfront payment, and then almost 2 or 3 days later, everything is in place. So it's quite nice. But what you need to be very careful about global players, I would say, bad point for me is that you are not necessarily sure that they totally control what they do in every single country. That's why local players can get a very nice added value in the sense that they really know about the regulations from the country you want to get the service of umbrella company from. Digital is quite nice because it's quite easy and it's easily done, and then everything is tracked. But same, what about the level of service? What about exactly the compliance? You need to be careful. Very often things that are easily done are not necessarily the most compliant. Second important point that you need to keep in mind, you need to define your needs. And if your need is above payroll and visa services. And for me, definitely, I would suggest you to be very careful about that, because you may decide to use umbrella services for some tricky countries to send your employees there, and still it may mean that they need some support and services and logistical services. And because you don't have any entity, you may appreciate that the umbrella company is able to manage that. But before defining your umbrella company, you need to define which services you will need so that you can identify if this umbrella company can respond to these needs. Other key points that you need to be careful about is the termination clause for the contract with the umbrella company. It's normal and natural, I would say. You want always to cover your ass. So termination clause may not necessarily be in your favor, not necessarily very flexible. So you need to keep an eye on this, just not to sign it blankly like this and straight away. Be careful. Notice period can be quite long. You may have some termination fees in terms of in case you terminate early the agreement with the umbrella company. So you need to be able to negotiate to include some flexibility, especially if you yourself, you don't have so much visibility about how long you intend to send the employee in this location. So it will be a bit worthless to get a termination clause with a notice period of 6 months if you are not really sure that the employee will stay more than 6 months itself. So it could become quite costly, the application of the early termination clause. What you need to be careful about is, of course, about the employment contract provisions, because it will not be you issuing the employment contract, but the umbrella company on your behalf for your benefit. So you need to check the employment provisions and if it's not creating any issue, and if overall it's compliant with what is applicable in this country. And last but not least, be very careful about the level of compliance and the potential impact into your risk management that this the potential non-compliance of the umbrella company may create for you. If the umbrella company is not necessarily doing things right, maybe at some point you may be in a tricky situation with regards to the employee. So it's not because there is not necessarily a contract between you and the employee directly that it's not creating any liability. So be careful about that. And I'm not speaking only about from a legal standpoint, but as well in terms of talent retention, employers branding. We need to be careful about what we do. Like I said earlier, and I think it's the same here, employee speak, employee gossip, the bad stories get a potential of spread much higher than a very nice story, so be careful about that. So now let's wrap it up with this very nice quote from Josep Borrell, and I think it's the same for all of us in our mind. COVID-19 will reshape our world. We don't know yet when the crisis will end, but we can be sure that by when the time does, our world will look very different. So my tip here is that don't try to keep the same world. It will never work. You need to adjust yourself, and you need to try to identify the new world coming up and be part of it, of building this new world.
You have now reached the end of September 2021 webinar recording proposed by Munich HR AfterWork. We have actually removed the Q&A session from this presentation to protect the personal data of all of our participants. Thank you for your interest in this format and for having watched the replay.